There's some applause for Prince and for one of the great party songs of the 1980s, though it is worth noting that, like many songs that are often thought of as being celebratory songs, this is actually quite a dark song. That song, put out in the early 1980s, is about the threat of nuclear war and the escalating threat of nuclear war as the Cold War was once again heating up in that moment. And the message of that song, "Party Like It's 1999, was a sort of apocalyptic, we might not be around for 1999 or 2000, and so we might as well party here where we are in the 1980s. And then, of course, we did make it to 1999 and 2000, so that is something to celebrate. But by the time we got there, people were less worried about nuclear war than about the fact that all of their computers might shut down. And that was the apocalyptic vision, which tells us something that I think we've seen many times over the course of this semester, which is that part of what history is all about is looking at people in their moment, trying to make sense of the past, to tell them where they might be going in the future. And sometimes they get it right. Sometimes they can't see what's coming. So today, does my microphone sound okay? It sounds very echoey up here. Okay, sounds different than it usually does, but that's fine. Today we're going to do a little bit of what Prince got us started doing there, which is to say we are going to begin in the 1980s and take a look in particular at the Reagan administration and the anti-communist politics of the 1980s. We're then going to make our way into the 1990s as a period of history that I would say is still being thought through and defined and redefined as we get a little more distance on it. One of the things that people often ask historians, as I've mentioned, is, when does something become history? And one rule of thumb is that it's about 30 years or so, which is to say, we begin to have enough distance to make sense of patterns, to be able to have memoirs and archives and reflections with some level of historical distance. And so the 1990s and 2000s to historians just happened. We're still figuring it out. And what we're going to do today is look at what have been two of the competing narratives for thinking about and defining the 1990s as a decade. One is about the rise of a post-Cold War consensus in domestic policy, in foreign policy, that seemed for a long time to be the dominant story of the 1990s. Some people would call it a Washington consensus, others a neoliberal consensus, but in a remarkable amount of accord around certain ideas about how the United States ought to be running its politics and economy, and also how it ought to be projecting its power into the world. There's also a counter-narrative that is deeply rooted and also important, which is that it's in the 1990s that some of the most important features of what we've come to describe as polarization in our politics come into being. So you might ask, how could that be a decade of consensus and a decade of polarization at the same time? It's a good question. It's one we're going to wrestle with, and it's one that I'm going to leave to all of you to wrestle with as well. But we're going to spend a lot of this lecture in the 1990s talking about that debate. And then we are going to try to finish up in the 21st century to get to about 2007, which is the year that, by my calculations, many of the first-year students in this class and at Yale and colleges more broadly were born. So, of course, another way to think about what is history is it's everything that happened before I was born. And I think one of the things that's been very fun in this class, particularly in these last couple of lectures, is to see where different people hit that moment. Right? So somewhere around the last week or the week before that, members of the community started coming up and saying, yeah, I remember that. Either that's how it happened, that's not how it happened. But I think the students have not actually had that experience yet. And I'm not sure that most people remember the year that they were born. But hopefully, by the end of lecture, we're going to be at least a little closer to the world that we all know and inhabit today. So to get started, I want to go back to where we left off on Thursday before Thanksgiving break, and that was with the election of Ronald Reagan. And we said at the time that in some ways we want to see Reagan's rise as a political figure as the product of a self-conscious movement with a clearly defined set of ideas about who they were, what they thought the United States ought to be, and in particular, how to govern if and when one came into power. And Ronald Reagan himself often described his own political history that way, described this moment that in 1981, quote unquote, conservatives finally had the White House, if not the Congress and certain other areas of American political power. And he says at the Conservative Political Action Conference in 1981, whatever history says about our cause, it has been the product of decades of work, and here we are, and we're going to have to figure out what to do. That speech, if you like political speech making, is a particularly interesting one because in that speech, Ronald Reagan name checks many, many, many of the events and figures and forces and ideas that we have encountered over the last couple of weeks. He talks about Friedrich Hayek and Russell Kirk as these big intellectual influences. He talks about William F. Buckley and National Review and Frank Meyer and Fusionism as having led to that moment. He talks about Barry Goldwater. He even name checks himself and says, in 1964, I made a great speech that outlined some great ideas, and here we are, yada, yada, yada. Here we are, and we can finally put some of this into action. And then he brings in newer figures, people that we haven't talked as much about. Milton Friedman, the economist, who in many ways is one of the intellectual architects of the Reagan era. And he talks a bit about Margaret Thatcher as well, and says very proudly, Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, and says very proudly that he just talked to her and they agreed, quote, that the cult of the state is finally dying, that they are together going to dismantle one of the big stories of the 20th century, which is the rise of powerful centralized states in the United States, in England, and elsewhere in the world. And he also positioned himself, this is a nod to Joanne, as an heir to the American Revolution. And he said, this is 1981. That means that it is the bicentennial of the victory at Yorktown. And he says, fellow citizens, fellow conservatives, our time is now, our moment has arrived. We stand together, shoulder to shoulder, in the thickest of the fight. So he is defining the politics of the 1980s really as a form of ideological struggle. But as most figures find, once they are in political office, governing is quite different from campaigning. And one of the big questions about the politics of the 1980s is, in fact, how much it's driven by these sets of ideas that are put into action, and how much it's actually, a sort of set of pragmatic exchanges and constraints like most political moments are. The most recent biography of Ronald Reagan makes the case that actually fundamentally, despite all of this, Reagan was really a pragmatist. And I think there are a lot of ways in which that turned out to be true of the 1980s. You're talking about an era of divided government. You're talking about a moment of constraints of varying sorts. And like most presidencies, the Reagan presidency turned out to be a whole lot of responding to crises that nobody necessarily saw coming. Among them, the AIDS crisis, which begins to emerge in the 1980s. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in lecture, but foreign policy crises as well. On the AIDS crisis, Reagan famously late and relatively hesitant to engage with that. But I would make the case that it is possible to see the 1980s and to see the Reagan era as really one of the moments when this anti-communist idea, which got its really start early in the 20th century, was institutionalized in new ways in the 40s and 50s, really comes to its peak, both as a way of thinking about the United States in the world and as a way of thinking about forging a path for domestic politics as well. One of Reagan's top priorities in coming into office was to reduce the top marginal tax rate. He had been a wealthy movie actor in the 40s and 50s at those moments when the top marginal tax rate got into the 90s, and never forgot that, but also acting on a set of ideas about how the economy ought to work, what the crises of the 70s had told. The notion of Reaganomics, or trickle-down economics, becomes one of the driving features of economic policy in particular in the 1980s. It involves tax cuts, it involves open markets, it involves forms of deregulation that really become Reagan's signatures in terms of political economy. Another signature feature of the 1980s is pushback against quote unquote big labor, but against the labor movement and the large labor institutions, industrial unions that had gotten their start in the 30s and 40s, reached their peak in the 50s and 60s, had a surge of activism in the 70s. But though Ronald Reagan in many ways got his political start as a labor union leader in the Screen Actors Guild, the 1980s becomes an era of deep pushback against organized labor in its institutional form. One of the most dramatic early examples of that was Reagan's decision to fire the air traffic controllers who went on strike in 1981. It's actually a really important moment, not only in the history of labor, but in the history of federal employment and how we think about federal workers and their relationship to the government and to the private sector, something that had dramatic consequences for the labor movement as well as for some of the questions that are still being sorted out today, not only about air traffic control, but about government employment more broadly. This gives some examples of the kind of dramatic impact that that moment of the 1980s had on the history of labor. You can see on this side that the pushback against PATCO in particular led to a dramatic decrease in the use of strikes as a form of political organizing. And over there, you can see that from that peak in the 1960s, beginning in the 70s, accelerating in the 1980s, and really continuing into the early 2000s, that labor surge of mid-century begins to come to an end. Now, there were some unintended consequences of all of this. The theory of Reaganomics was that it was going to produce so much economic growth that lower taxes, less regulation would produce economic growth that would not only trickle down from the rich to the poor, but that would actually increase rather than decrease the tax base. But it turns out, actually, if you lower tax rates, you have less tax revenue, and that was one of the great lessons of the 1980s. And so the 1980s become one of the most significant periods of deficit spending, something that is going to continue on for decades to come. But I think for many people who were within the movement and within the Reagan administration, that too had a silver lining. There was a theory that became very popular in the 70s and 80s that was captured by the phrase starve the beast, which is to say the only way that you were going to make inroads into this New Deal state, this expansive federal government, the regulatory and administrative state, in particular the social welfare state as well, was simply by not providing money, by shrinking the tax base. If the money's there, it's going to be spent. And so this is David Stockman, who was Reagan's budget director, who was a champion of that general idea. So I think we can see these policies as, on the one hand, pragmatic responses to crises that emerged in the 1970s, particularly the inflation or stagflation crisis of that era, but they're being driven by a set of ideas that are very much rooted in the world of mid-century anti-communism, and that is the world that in many ways made Ronald Reagan. And of course, we can see that playing out in the 1980s as well, the last real decade of the Cold War. The most famous moment in all of that is, of course, Reagan in 1987 in Berlin saying, "Tear down this wall," a famous speech. But in many ways, his approach to the Cold War was a little more complicated and mixed than that. Beginning in the 70s, when he was a candidate and was asked about Cold War strategy, he had a very definite, straightforward, he would say, some people say this is overly simplistic, but my strategy for the Cold War is this: we win, they lose. And this has since become, one of the defining features of the Reagan-era grand strategy of his approach to the Cold War, but it had many, many different features. Among them was a military buildup in the United States, sort of a revival after Vietnam of what Dwight Eisenhower had called the military-industrial complex, but a buildup of the military and of defense forces, including Reagan's favorite programs, Star Wars, which was intended to be a missile shield over the United States that was never built. It involved extensive hot war interventions in many places around the world, most notably in Latin America and Central America, where a lot of the fiercest conflicts of the Reagan years took place. And then it involved a set of negotiations with the Soviet Union in a direct sense, negotiations around nuclear arms reduction, negotiations around cultural exchange and political and economic reform. This is Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, who became leader of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s, and worked very closely with Reagan around making these kinds of political, cultural, and economic exchanges more possible. So when we got to the end of the 1980s, Reagan looks out and says, hey, what are we heading into? We're heading into a world in which the US and the Soviet Union are going to have a much more cooperative relationship. We're still going to try to achieve peace through strength. We still view the Soviet Union as an ideological enemy in some ways, but his prediction in 1989, as he is leaving office, is that the US and the Soviet Union have entered a new era of cooperation and of coming together in some way. In fact, his biggest warning when he leaves office is not about the Cold War. It's not about communism. It's about a worry he has about the United States itself, that Americans are forgetting their own history and that they are forgetting what it means to be patriotic. That is his great warning, right? When Dwight Eisenhower delivered his farewell address, he said, I am here to tell you that the military-industrial complex is one of the great new forces in American history. It's something you're going to have to think about and contend with and deal with for the rest of the 20th century. Reagan says that his big worry is that the United States is coming apart, that Americans don't know their history, that they don't know how to engage in an informed patriotism. Now, Reagan's idea of that was to some degree telling great heroic stories from World War II and about the heroic founders, in some ways things that we would probably not be teaching in quite the same way in a class like this. But I do find it interesting that he was naming that as something that we ought to be thinking about. And he also told the children of the late 1980s that if your parents have not been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do. Not quite sure what he meant by that. But that was his great message to the nation. All of which is to say that even Ronald Reagan, even someone who staked most of his political career on anti-communism, who said, we win, they lose, tear down this wall, did not see what was about to happen just months after he left office, which is that the Berlin Wall was going to come down in the middle of 1989, that the Soviet Union itself was going to collapse 2 years later, and that many of the assumptions and ways of doing politics, not only on the global stage, that had been the central features of the world that he had known, began to change abroad, but also at home. All right, now I want to turn to the 1990s, which, as I said, is a decade whose history is still very much in formation. We are, in some ways, not very far out from the events we're going to be talking about for the rest of lecture. And there is an active debate underway about what exactly was going on in these transitional years of the 1990s into the 21st century, in which lots of old assumptions, lots of old institutions, lots of old ways of doing business are being upended, thrown out the window. New ones are being invented, but their meaning both then and I think still now were not necessarily entirely clear. One interpretation of what began to happen in the 1980s, but especially after 1989 and into the 1990s, is a story about consensus. That one of the features of the 20th century was these sets of great ideological struggles, first with fascism, second with communism, and that after this moment in the late 1980s, the contours of those ideological struggles changed dramatically, and as your reading for this week would suggest, maybe even go away altogether. The main reading for this week is an essay that came out in the summer of 1989 by a political theorist named Francis Fukuyama, who was a neoconservative, who's one of many people kind of looking at this hinge moment in history, trying to think about what's happening. And his declaration is that the end of history is nigh. Now, it's worth noting that the original version of this is the end of history ? By the time it came out in book form a little later, it was the end of history has come, and that's partly because of the succession of events that happened so rapidly between the moment that this essay came out and the moment that it was expanded as a book just a little while later. An intense period of change, especially on the global stage. But the central premise of this essay is not, in fact, that history is going to end in the sense that there are going to be no more events, that there are going to be no more conflicts, but that fundamental set of ideological struggles that had defined the 20th century in particular had been resolved, and it had been resolved in favor of Western liberal democratic capitalism. That this was, by the 1990s, the only world system that anyone could imagine anymore. Its chief competitors had been discredited. Those who were not brought under that umbrella were just exceptions or crackpots or run-of-the-mill strong-arm authoritarians, but that in terms of conceiving of how to run the world, there was only one idea left. And this became a very, very popular narrative in the 1990s. That idea maybe can be described as Western liberalism, as Fukuyama says. Its critics tended to describe it as neoliberalism, a set of institutions and ideas that emphasized individual choice, free choice, open markets, forms of globalization that become really some of the dominant narratives and policies of the 1990s. The standard bearer of that change is often seen in this story to be this man here, Bill Clinton, who is elected president in 1992. And in this story about the coming together of some sort of 1990s consensus, Clinton is often the chief figure because so much of what he says seems to echo a framework about markets and choice and shrinking government, dismantling the 20th century state that had been features of the Reagan administration and then the Bush administration. The most famous statement of that is Clinton's declaration in 1996 that, quote, "The era of big government is over. We know that big government does not have all the answers," right? A dramatic difference from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even the Great Society vision. Reagan himself came out of an effort to reform and change the Democratic Party from within through the Democratic Leadership Committee that became the Democratic Leadership Council. And in 1990, they outlined what they thought ought to be some of the fundamental principles of a new Democratic Party going forward. First of all, they wanted to be able to win elections again, which the Democrats had not been very good at doing. But they employed phrases like expand opportunity, not government, deter crime and punish criminals, engage in liberty of conscience, individual responsibility, work, faith, family, and putting an emphasis on responsibilities as well as rights. So a very self-conscious effort, in fact, to shift the approach, the nature, the meaning of 1990s liberalism in ways that are in this analysis, fundamentally in the same universe of ideas as their political opponents. It is worth noting that this does, in fact, prove to be successful. And in some ways, you can see that Clinton still has some of the old Democratic Party coalition operating. He does win states in the Deep South. He is himself really the last great Southern Democrat to rise to office in this way. He is also the embodiment of an essential new part of the Democratic coalition, which is Northeastern liberals, college-educated elites coming into being. You might recognize these people. You might recognize this location. So this is Bill and Hillary Clinton at Yale, which is where they met. Probably the single most consequential romantic meeting that ever happened in a Yale library happened there. Students, this is how people used to meet each other. They used to meet each other by looking across the library where they were sitting, reading books in real life and seeing each other. At any rate, we have Bill and Hillary there. A lot of this new paradigm gets expressed through a set of trade policies that become the signature features of quote-unquote globalization in the 1990s. The most famous of them is the passage of NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, which when it is passed during the Clinton years is particularly interesting because it is handed down from previous Republican administrations to a Democratic administration and put into effect. And there are other areas in which during the 1990s, there's a lot of accord around the sorts of reforms that are going to be implemented. It's under Clinton that we see welfare reform come in, a set of work requirements for welfare recipients, very different vision of the social welfare state coming into being. We have Clinton in the middle there signing the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is largely, though not totally, deregulatory and is one of the pieces of legislation that really sets up how the internet in particular, which is just emerging, is ultimately going to be governed or not governed. Another example from a more cultural end of things is the Defense of Marriage Act, which Clinton also signs on to, which is effectively a ban on gay marriage. Yet another area in which you see remarkable accord, both between Democrats and Republicans, but also in terms of longer-term trends, is around responses to a growing crime rate and the rise of incarceration. As you can see from this graph, there's very little differentiation from the 80s to the 90s or between different administrations. A lot of this is happening through this kind of consensus politics. And I'll just mention one more, which is growing inequality. This is a moment in which inequality begins to grow. The 90s are in some ways boom years, particularly in the first tech boom, the internet boom of that era. But it is also an era in which the inequality that we have come to know so well really begins to take off. One last area I'll mention is in terms of immigration policy. The United States, after the 1965 Immigration Act, is moving once more into an era of mass immigration, though that immigration is coming from very different parts of the world than we saw when we were there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And though immigration politics in our moment is a very fraught and divided set of questions, for much of this period, that was, in fact, not the case. In fact, it's during the Reagan years that an amnesty program for undocumented people in the United States comes into being. Right, so that is the argument for the 1990s as a period of consensus in domestic policy. There's a good argument for that being the case in the realm of global affairs as well. The end of the Cold War being the thing that everyone is contending with throughout this period, and many of the most dramatic moments of intervention and conflict happen in some ways in a consensus form. The Gulf War, the rise of concern over terrorism, and then ultimately the response to 9/11, which becomes quite controversial by the several years out, and there are always people who are fighting about the particulars in any given moment, but for the most part emerges in a very bipartisan way. I want to take a moment now and just watch an important video of a political figure who emerges in this moment as someone who is trying to reformulate, double down on, but also speak to this politics of 1990s consensus. This is, of course, Barack Obama. This is his 2004 speech at the Democratic National Convention. Like Ronald Reagan's 1964 speech for Barry Goldwater, this is really what launches Obama. And I think it's particularly interesting to watch this speech as both a reflection of and an attempt to produce a kind of consensus politics for the 90s and then into the 21st century.
John Kerry believes in America, and he knows that it's not enough for just some of us to prosper. For alongside our famous individualism, there's another ingredient in the American saga, a belief that we're all connected as one people. If there is a child on the south side of Chicago who can't read, that matters to me even if it's not my child. If there's a senior citizen somewhere who can't pay for their prescription drugs and having to choose between medicine and the rent, that makes my life poorer even if it's not my grandparent. If there's an Arab American family being rounded up without benefit of an attorney or due process, that threatens my civil liberties. It is that fundamental belief. It is that fundamental belief, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, that makes this country work. It's what allows us to pursue our individual dreams and yet still come together as one American family. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states. Red states for Republicans, blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states, and yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states. There are patriots who opposed the war in Iraq, and there are patriots who supported the war in Iraq. We are one people, all of us pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, all of us defending the United States of America.
All right. All right. You applaud for Prince, you applaud for Barack Obama. So now I want to turn to a different speech. A speech that tells the other side of this story, because despite what Obama was saying there, it turns out that there was, at least to some degree, a red America and a blue America already forming during these years. And as historians have looked back on the 1990s, tried to tell that story that is about polarization, that is not about the country coming together in this moment, but about the country flying apart. Many of them point to this 1992 speech by Pat Buchanan at the Republican National Convention. Pat Buchanan, someone who had a long history in conservative politics, had worked in the Nixon administration, had become a TV star of a sort in the cable shows of the 1980s and 90s, and was a well-known figure, ran for the 1992 Republican nomination on really a paleo-conservative platform, as we would describe it, on a platform of nationalism, cultural conservatism. And this speech is, for many historians trying to make sense of the 1990s, a moment to look to because it is a declaration of war of a sort. And you'll hear what kind of war Pat Buchanan thinks that he's raging.
This party is my home, this party is our home, and we've got to come home to it. And don't let anyone tell you different. Yes, we disagreed with President Bush, but we stand with him for the freedom to choose religious schools. And we stand with him against the amoral idea that gay and lesbian couples should have the same standing in law as married men and women. We stand with President Bush. We stand with President Bush for right to life and for voluntary prayer in the public schools. And we stand against putting our wives and daughters and sisters into combat units of the United States Army. And we stand, my friends, we also stand with President Bush in favor of the right of small towns and communities to control the raw sewage of pornography that so terribly pollutes our popular culture. We stand with President Bush in favor of federal judges who interpret the law as written and against would-be Supreme Court justices like Mario Cuomo, who think they have a mandate to rewrite the Constitution. Friends, this election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side.
All right, so this idea of a cultural war, of a religious war, a culture war, is one of the central features of the politics of polarization, or the polarization narrative that begins to emerge as a way of understanding another aspect of what's going on in the 1990s. And as you can see, polarization is something that political scientists have tried to document in a variety of ways, one of which is, do you believe that the people with whom you disagree are not only people with whom you disagree, but a threat to the nation's very well-being? And you can see that that kind of rhetoric really begins to escalate in the 1990s into the early 2000s, and of course, in many ways, has continued to this moment. So what is beginning to produce this in the 1990s is not only a new set of cultural issues that Pat Buchanan was identifying, abortion, AIDS, gay rights as they emerge as points of national contest, education, universities, campus politics, many of the features that probably seem pretty recognizable in what we might describe as the culture wars still going on today are really taking formation in the 1980s and 1990s. And Buchanan is reflecting a little bit of that. There's also a change in the structure of politics that's very important in the 1980s into the 1990s. Part of that are reforms to the primary system that began back in the 1970s and that are coming to produce more contested primary popular elections, and some would argue pushing people to the margins. Others are new styles of politics that are intended to play to not only these new structures, but a new media environment. One of the leaders of that is Newt Gingrich, who in 1994 led a Republican resurgence in the House, and in fact led the Republican Party to take over the House for the first time since 1954. So a big watershed moment in terms of control of Congress, but as importantly, Gingrich is someone who says we are going to have to stand together as a bloc around a very particular set of ideas, in this case in opposition to a Democratic White House, but also a move from House elections, which had been very local in many ways before, to the much more unified way of thinking about what's at stake in national elections that we're all familiar with today. Coming out of this is one of the first great showdowns of the 1990s. Again, something that's become so familiar to us, but was incredibly unusual, very dramatic, the source of a lot of conflict in that moment, which is the first government shutdown. A war over the budget between the Clinton administration and the Republican House that, as you can see, does not result in an unalloyed victory for Gingrich, who in many ways is really the architect of it, but does set in motion a new form of politics. The media landscape changes dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s as well. First, with the rise of cable news, which matters because politics becomes more theatrical. If you know that there are cameras around you, you're going to perform for cameras. So even the seemingly benign C-SPAN, even what was then the major 24-hour news channel like CNN, has a really dramatic effect on how we conduct our politics. And then in the 1980s, the quote-unquote fairness doctrine, which had required that most broadcast outlets, if you're taking on a political issue, you give equal airtime to both sides. As the technology of communications changes once again, in this case, cable news, those old doctrines fall away, and we get the rise of a much more partisan set of media institutions which begin to shape the political discourse. Rush Limbaugh and his talk radio show in the 1980s is one example, and then the rise of Fox News in the 1990s. All of these come together to produce what then and now has been described as a kind of new culture of scandal and of media engagement in American politics, many of those centered around the Clinton administration, but a commitment to a kind of partisan political warfare, which had existed, of course, for a long time, but now is playing a much different and more significant role. There's a rise of certain kinds of extremist political violence in the 1990s that become a real channeling point for these debates about polarization. Is the country coming together or is it flying apart? Most notably, the Oklahoma City bombing. And then the kind of great moment of conflict or division that seems to symbolize this polarization narrative as it's emerged over the course of the 1990s is, of course, the deadlocked 2000 election in which the country seems so evenly split, in which the election results are not determined for weeks and months, and we end up with the outcome we end up with. All right, I want to finish up here in these last couple of minutes by thinking a little bit about how we want to put these stories together, right? So these seem to be really at odds with each other. How can there be consensus and polarization happening simultaneously? I think one of the reasons we see this is, as I said, this is all history that's still being written. And in fact, as the events of the 21st century change, we're going to keep looking back to these moments and reinterpreting them and thinking about them. I suspect for many people here, the polarization narrative seems like maybe the more meaningful one and the one that best describes our world. But in fact, we know that history did not end in 1989, and I think that it's worth keeping in mind for all of us that it hasn't ended in this moment yet either. We're still making it, we're still reflecting on it, and we're still in it as we sit here today. I wanted to finish by taking a look at 2007 and taking up this question of how much we're still in the world that was made in that moment, the moment that many undergraduates were born or were just coming into some sort of early consciousness. This is a Gallup poll from 2007, and I think it's interesting because it reflects some pieces of the political consciousness of that moment that are not front and center for us, most notably the centrality of the war in Iraq as a concern in terms of voting, in terms of morality, in terms of how the US wanted to act in the world. And then there are other hints in there of issues that are going to grow and become so important over the next 15 to 20 years. Illegal immigration, as it's phrased there, among others. But what really struck me about looking at this is how little people in 2007 could see what was going to be happening by 2008, which is to say, really momentous things that have fundamentally reshaped our own world were all going to happen within months of that poll. One, the iPhone went on sale in the middle of 2007, became widespread by 2008, changed the way we relate to our politics, changed the way we relate to each other in ways that few people could have imagined. Barack Obama ends up being elected somewhat unexpectedly, both for the Democratic nomination and then ultimately for the presidency, a landmark moment in American history, the country's first Black president, which is going to have lots of consequences to come. And then the financial crisis of 2008 really takes off. Within months of that poll, again, people could see little glimmers of it. They were able to contend with it to some degree in that moment. But as you can see here, one of the tools that we always have for trying to make sense of new and surprising things is to look to the past. So that's what we have tried to do in this course. We have tried to look to the past in order to give you some tools for making sense of the present. This has been particularly important as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which is now upon us in just a few months, the inspiration for the class. But I hope that as you have made your way through all of this, you find new ways to think about the past, to think about your present, and also to use the past to envision the kind of future that you might want. I feel very honored to be up here and to have gone through the 20th century with you. I hope that as we have done this, you have not only found places to critique and understand and reflect, but also some things to celebrate about the United States and its traditions, because we're headed into that as well. And so I thought that I would finish this lecture. We'll do a little wrap up on Thursday, but since this is the end of my part of the course, and we have in fact gotten into the 21st century from 1776 to the 21st century in one semester, as we set out to do, I thought we could finish up with a song from one of the great divas of the early 20th century, and it is a fun celebratory song, and David Blight promised that he would dance with me again. So we're going to finish up with Ms. Miley Cyrus, 2009, Party in the USA. Everyone should come dance. David and I are going to dance. You should all come join if you want, but thank you all for a really great time.
So I put my hand